All right, everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started now. So this is our VFM Back to Basics about MPFC and gender and sexuality. So I just want to remind everybody so to please mute yourselves. We will be recording this session so that it can be available to everybody after the fact. And if you have any immediate questions, you can go ahead and type them to me at Military Partners and Families Coalition through the chat box function. And if you have any other questions, you can save them until the end, and we'll have a Q&A about all of the material we've gone over. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Our presenter today is our president, Ariana Bostian-Kentes. So Ariana, with that, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Colin. So you'll have to forgive me. I've never actually presented on the GoToMeeting platform before, but I think I got the rundown of it now. So hopefully this goes pretty seamlessly. So we wanted to spend some time this month going back to the basics, doing a little bit of an overview of Military Partners and Families Coalition, our areas of work, and then transitioning over to just basically a 101 on gender and sexuality. It may seem like that's something that's not necessary information for those of us maybe who identify within that population of LGBTQ people. But we know that a lot of folks sign into our VFMs and watch them later who maybe don't identify within the communities. And also I think it's important to just do a refresher sometimes on current best practices, as it were, of ways of speaking about gender and sexuality so that we can be the most inclusive as possible, so that we're using correct terminology when possible. Also with the acknowledgement that these things change over time, words change over time, our understanding of these concepts has evolved over time. So this is the May 2015 version of what may be a little bit different, who knows, 6 months from now, a year from now. Yeah, so that's where we're gonna start today. All right, so a little bit more of an introduction. As Colin mentioned, my name is Ariana Bostian-Kentes. I am the president and one of the co-founders of the Military Partners and Families Coalition. I'm also a military partner myself. My partner is a captain in the Army Reserve right now. Her name's Stephanie, and she should be signing on to this at some point. In my day job, I serve as the assistant director at the University of Michigan Spectrum Center, which is the university's LGBT center. It was the first LGBT center on any college campus in the country, so we have a very rich history, has been around since 1971, at least 10 years before the next LGBT center was even created on a campus. So because of that, I have a lot of knowledge in this area. I've been there for almost 7 years, and this has been part of the work that I do with regard to educating people on these concepts, doing advocacy and policy work, supporting students on our campus, all those sort of things. So an overview of what we're going to try to cover today in our 1 hour together. We're going to do a brief overview of MPFC, a little bit about where we came from, and the current programs that we hold. We're going to do an LGBT 101, break down some concepts around gender and sexuality, talk about some terminology, and move over to recommendations for how this may relate to your own work, whether it's in advocacy or in your day job, whatever that may be, whether it's, online stuff, talking about these concepts, reading articles, just understanding what these different terms mean and how they're being used. And finally, the last part, we're going to open up for questions and discussion. So as Colin said, please feel free to chat him questions throughout. We will go through them at the end. Really, this is a time to ask anything. This is the opportunity where I won't make you feel silly for asking a question that maybe you think should be obvious. This stuff does get complex, and so I want to recognize that and honor the fact that this is the time to ask those quote-unquote silly questions. So moving into an overview of MPFC. Little bit about us. So the co-founders, we've all met in 2010, really in the Secretary of Defense's personal conference room at the Pentagon. It was a pretty interesting meeting. It was really cool experience because a lot of us had been doing some online advocacy stuff, whether it was blogging or all sorts of different things. And we were identified through that work and our membership to different organizations, and we're all brought there to the same place to really tell our stories, which was something that had never been asked before. We were always the ones who had been silent, the ones who were in the background under the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. When they were doing research, the Comprehensive Review Working Group on deciding what would happen were Don't Ask, Don't Tell to be repealed, they couldn't really do outreach to active duty service members themselves for fear of putting their own identities and their own jobs at risk. So they reached out to partners and family members, and that's how we all came together. And then in 2011, we kind of looked around and we thought, well, there's some great work going on for active duty service members and a lot of stuff around advocacy, and we realized there wasn't anything that was specifically around support for family members. So that was our mission. That's why we created MPFC in 2011, and we built it intentionally around a coalition structure so that we didn't have to reinvent the wheel. We knew that there was a lot of really great military support organizations out there. So we decided to do the outreach, to knock on the doors, to build relationships with the other organizations that existed, and then also figure out and do some gap analysis to figure out where there were gaps in supporting our families. You know, what was preventing our families from emerging from the shadows, from kind of telling our stories, other than the obvious Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, and the fact that by being visible, we might put our own partners and spouses at risk for losing their livelihoods. So that's when we came to be. Since then, we've grown in lots of different ways. We have a board of 9 directors currently, and the entire organization is completely volunteer run. So everybody is kind of doing this on the side, doing this as a passion, a personal passion of theirs. Some of our board members are veterans themselves. Some are partners of service members, whether active duty, reserve, guard, veterans. And it's really important for us to have that type of grassroots structure because our strength comes from the communities of which we are a part. Our mission is to provide support, education, resources, and advocacy for the families of LGBT service members. Not a tall order, right? We cover all of that, and this includes every branch in active duty, reserves, guard, and veterans. So we have initiatives in a few different areas: family support programs, educational outreach, resource development, media engagement, policy consulting, and I feel like there's probably a few things that don't necessarily either fall in one of those categories or maybe bridge more than one of those categories. So a little bit more about what we do. Our family support program. So we have a Battle Buddy program, and this was something that was one of the first things that we decided was important. And really, it was when we came together at the Pentagon, we realized that all of us, well, not only were we not alone, we had found each other, we had, you know, been in a meeting room together, but we also felt that we were very alone. We were in different parts of the country. Some of us were in states where we thought that we were the only LGBT family who was military. So people were spread out, people were going through deployments, and people needed support. So we created the Battle Buddy program to bridge those connections between people so that they could find one another, so they could ask advice, so that they could really, you know, do that type of FRG, the Family Readiness Group support that a lot of families couldn't be a part of at the time. So certainly things have changed a little bit, just as the intent of our programs has changed along with the times in terms of what is needed now. But this is still, we found something that folks are interested in is receiving that one-on-one support just around different difficulties that all of us as military families might encounter. Our virtual family meetings, of which you're on right now. We have our webinars, and it's a information and discussion space for LGBT and A military families. We'd like to say it's professionally facilitated by a professional facilitator. They could put that on their resume as soon as they facilitate one of these. And there's different topics and guest speakers for each month. So we'll do a little bit of a overview at the end of what's to come. We also do lots of social events, understanding that sometimes you just need to have a brunch spot or a potluck, or to, you know, do something that really brings the military family communities together. That was such an important thing that was missing during the Don't Ask, Don't Tell era that we just could not either find each other or access one another. We had to have these secret underground kind of meetups and doing things virtually online. So one of the things that we do today is make sure that we have a visible presence, whether it's monthly brunches in DC or partnering with other organizations around the country in military communities, having a presence at Pride celebrations all over the country. All those are really important for the visibility of our community and our families. We also are very involved in research and advocacy work. So that's one of the things that really separates us from other organizations, I think, is that we have been in it from the beginning doing studies. We did the first survey to focus on the health and mental health needs of LGBT military communities. So this is something that's been built on since then. We used the results of our own survey to advocate for the creation and development of programs to meet the needs of our families, but it's also being used as a research for further studies. One of the bigger organizations that's using our research as a basis is the Naval Center for Combat Operational Stress Control. I believe that's what the acronym stands for. So Scott Johnston over there has been using our work to really build on some amazing things, and they're doing a lot of great research serving the entire military community on just climate for LGBT folks and awareness and access to health resources. One of the things that we're working on right now is an inclusive childcare project. Both this and the family survey were funded by an award that we applied for from the National Library of Medicine, National Institutes of Health, and the Department of Health and Human Services. So we're very thankful to them and their support over the years of our research and really doing some work that was groundbreaking around this population that had never been studied before because people couldn't find us. So part of this project is going to be, it has been, sending out a survey, doing a literature review, and using those two things to go toward the development of a training aid for child care providers. So we are still running the survey. In order to participate, there are the links at the bottom of this slide. We are still taking entries, and I believe if you take the survey, you're entered to win a $25 gift card, so that's always good incentive too. So in addition to our research, we've also done a lot of educational outreach over the years. So we've done trainings, workshops, spoken on panels, done multiple cultural competency trainings for mental health providers, for military policymakers. We've done them for the emerging military leader. My partner Stephanie and I have gone to multiple ROTC programs at different universities to work with their graduating cadets, the ones who are going to leave and go be platoon leaders, and talk to them about how to build an inclusive command climate. So getting to them from the get-go has been really, really important, because when they graduate, when they commission, they're the ones who are going to be the future leaders, the ones creating policy, the ones who decide who is included in the military that they want to be a part of, that they want to lead, and who isn't included. We've also done trainings for the family support organizations. So we've worked with the American Red Cross, the Center for Deployment Psychology, numerous other organizations to assist them and consult with them on the great programs that already exist under their auspices, and then help them to think about how they can do intentional outreach to LGBTQ communities, and also just create programs that, you know, they maybe have thought were serving everyone, but they might have had a small oversight on, you know, how LGBT families can have access to certain things. Faces of Our Families is another really important educational component of what we do, and it's honestly, you know, just sharing our military families with one another and with the greater community, just raising our visibility, understanding that our families come in all shapes and sizes, all types of different makeups, and we are all military families. That's the one thread, the common thread that ties us all together. So we do this with our ally spouses and families, as well as our LGBT military families. All of this also leads toward our resource development. We've got a lot of great resources on our website, www.milpfc.org. On our website, you'll find not only just upcoming events going on, but information on benefits, information on employment opportunities, mental health resources, You know, even I think there's some resources on where to get LGBT inclusive wedding decorations and preparations for that sort of planning. So there's a lot of information on there. It's being updated all the time. That and our Facebook page are probably the best and most updated resources for which to gain access to this sort of thing. And our coalition as a resource. As I said at the beginning of the overview, we were very intentionally structured as a coalition. I think, you know, bringing together people who have people and organizations who have maybe a little bit different focuses from one another, but really are all working toward the same mission, and it's to serve military families of all different types. So we've built relationships with all sorts of coalition members. A more complete list is on our website, but here are some logos from some of the military and other types of organizations that we consider coalition members. So everything from the National Military Family Association, which is one of our first coalition members, to TAPS, to Hiring Our Heroes, giveanhour.org, and we did some really awesome work with NPR's StoryCorps program a couple years ago. So the other part of what we do with regard to media engagement, and again, education, visibility, policy consulting, we're pretty consistently asked to speak to various media outlets on our lives, essentially, the current issues and topics as they relate to our actual families. So here are just a couple of examples of when we've been in the media before. One of my favorites is our board member Dee giving her wife Tanya a look that, I don't know, many wives give their wives and their significant others, I would imagine. They were doing an interview on HuffPost Live. So that's a really great opportunity for us to talk about, you know, these abstract ideas that we hear about in the news, these controversial things, but putting a human face to them, putting a human story. These are actually our families that are navigating these policies and these very public discussions on our own lives, honestly. We're also consulted as subject matter experts on policy proposals by the White House, the DoD, lots of different places, asking, you know, we're rethinking some of the things that we're doing, and how can we, when we rethink this the second time, how can we be more intentionally inclusive with the way that we're wording this, or who we're thinking about, who's not at the table, all those sort of things. All right, so that's kind of a wrap-up of our MPFC overview. Like I said, there's a lot of stuff going on that we do. The best place to find it all is on our Facebook page and our website. So I will have that information up again at the end for you to access that. All right, we're going to take a breath and then move into the LGBT 101. LGBTQ 101, my apologies. Speaking of words, I use the terms LGBT or LGBTQ to reference the entire community. You've heard me say it probably 15 times already. Sometimes this terminology gets confusing. There's a lot of letters that are in that acronym. There's a lot of letters that are missing from that acronym. Maybe you've seen LGBTQIA, LMNOP, that sort of thing. It does get confusing, and LGBTQ is just kind of an umbrella term to talk about really gender and sexuality minorities in terms of you know, our specific U.S. culture, but I think it goes across the board in many different cultures and countries as well. So when you have questions, when you're asking them toward the end, please don't worry about saying the right thing. We're going to cover some of what is the right thing, but that's really what we're here to learn today is where does some of this terminology come from? What's the most up-to-date thing to use, and you know, what's appropriate, what's inappropriate, what's outdated, all that sort of thing. So point of reference, I will say that it is always safe to say LGBT community or LGBTQ community. So those terms specifically, they stand for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and the Q can either stand for queer or questioning. So those are not interchangeable terms. I'm going to go into a little bit more depth in a couple slides about what those terms actually mean. But when we see that acronym, that's what it stands for. It stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer or questioning. It's important to note that this acronym, LGBTQ, is inclusive of both gender and sexuality terms. So some of them specifically and exclusively refer to sexuality, and some refer to gender and gender identity. So why do we focus on the LGBT population? Well, other than the obvious, that we are an organization that is in our mission to focus on the LGBT population. But it's a population that is very overtly affected by the current systems and attitudes of discrimination. Certainly not the only population that experiences those types of things, but that's the one that we're focusing on because that's part of our mission. So LGBT people often experience minority stress, and it stems from lots of things, including cultural stigma, harmful stereotypes, but really those systems and policies that are intentionally exclusionary help to create that cultural stigma. So we also experience institutional discrimination in many ways. So laws, policies that deny us benefits, protections that are provided to other groups of people based on who they are. So Michigan is where I'm currently residing. Definitely one of those states that is very unfriendly to LGBT people. Definitely no marriage equality here. We're hoping, that might look a little different in a month or two after the Supreme Court comes back with a decision. But more importantly for a lot of folks, I think it's that recognition that people like me can get fired from their job, denied housing, denied service in a restaurant in many, many places in this state where I go, unless there are local protections or if my employer protects me. So the University of Michigan happens to have those type of protections in place, but the vast majority of organizations and businesses within my state and in many other states do not have those protections. So if you are an out person, or if you even are perceived to be gender nonconforming or LGB, then you could be at risk for losing your job or being denied service, housing, etc. That's why this is important. So the LGBT population also, I know this is kind of a busy slide, but I'll walk you through it here, are thwarted at every level of this Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So I put it up here. If anyone's taken kind of a Psych 101 class, you may be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Basically, it's this idea that there are base needs that need to be fulfilled. Those base needs at the bottom of the pyramid need to be fulfilled before a person can try to access the needs that are on higher levels. So in order to even survive, we need food, water, safety from violence. Once we got that covered, then we can think about gaining shelter, warmth, livelihood, money, job, that sort of thing. And once we have that secured, then we can start thinking about communities that we're part of, having a career, being comfortable where we live. And once we have that, then it's those higher levels, that intimacy, it's family, it's also things like critical thinking, a lot of things that we want people to be able to reach and access. They can't possibly get there to those higher levels of the pyramid if they're feeling threatened at those lower levels. So those physical safety levels, we as a population in general are at high risk for verbal and physical violence. That next level, that physical health level, LGBT people face housing and job discrimination on a constant basis. That mental health level, that community, career, comfort level, LGBT people are often the focus of family, religious, societal disdain through the media, through education, all these messages that we see and we hear on a constant basis. Those also threaten our own mental health and our ability to feel like we can be safe and part of a community. And that top level, that spiritual health level, that self-actualization level, oftentimes we're thwarted from even having that sort of thing because of marriage and adoption laws and all sorts of things that keep people out of these structures that provide that intimacy, that provide that safety, that provide that sense of care and well-being for our families. So this is also why it's important. The impact of psychosocial stressors on LGBT people happens at every single level of this hierarchy of needs. All right. So let's move into the gender and sexuality piece. Let's break down some of these ideas. So what exactly are we describing when we talk about, let's say sex, for example? And we're talking right now about the noun, not the verb, because it's Sunday. But when I talk about sex, that is a classification that's based on reproductive biology. So sex is assigned at birth. The agency lies usually with a physician, and that's the person who writes the M or the F on that birth certificate. So sex can be determined a few ways. Can be defined through internal or external genitalia, through the hormones that someone has in their body, or through chromosomes. Sex isn't, actually that black and white, because it can change through all those different ways. Maybe someone has genitalia that don't necessarily match up with the hormones they have in their body, or maybe their chromosomes, they have like an XXY instead of an XX or an XY. So I don't know if we have any biologists or scientists on the call, but those are just some of the different ways that we define sex and how we talk about it. So again, the important pieces of sex, it's a classification. It's usually based on reproductive biology, and it is assigned to you. It is assigned at birth. So that is different from the concept of gender or gender identity. So this is one of the most important things. If you take nothing else away today, it's understanding the difference between sex and gender, I think, is so critical to our understanding of the LGBTQ communities and of this work. So gender is one's internal sense of self. It's not inherently connected to physical anatomy at all. It can align with or be different than someone's sex that they were assigned at birth. So while sex is assigned to someone at birth, the person themselves assigns their own gender identity. So that's where the agency lies. The power to assign that lies with the person, the own person who identifies. It is my internal sense of self. That is my gender. So gender expression. This is the way in which we communicate our gender, and it's the way our gender is read by others around us and society around us. So sometimes our gender expression matches the gender identity that we know for ourselves. So using myself as an example, let's see, I'm going to go through these three categories because they're all pretty related. So the sex that I was assigned at birth was female. The gender that I know to be myself is a woman. And my gender expression, it's kind of fluid sometimes. Stephanie likes to say that I'm dapper femme, depending on if I'm wearing a bow tie that day or not. But it's really the way that I express the gender that I see myself as. And I have some freedom to do that. I'm pretty safe in the city that I live in and my job to express my gender in a few different ways and not have that really put myself at risk. Not everyone has that luxury. Sometimes the people can't express their gender the way that they internally identify for their own safety. They might not want to, lose their job or be a victim of physical violence, lots of different reasons. But gender expression is often the way that we do express our own gender identity. So these three concepts are distinct because they all have to do with one person and not in relation to anyone else. It's sex, gender identity, and expression have to do with an individual. So sexual orientation is different. It is different from all these because it's really how people relate to one another. It's who we are in the context of others in terms of our attractionality. So the definition that we have here is a person's emotional, physical, and sexual attraction and the expression of that attraction with other individuals. So emotional, physical, sexual, I think there are other ways that folks are attracted to one another. Sometimes instead of sexual orientation, I like to say attractionality because I think it's a little bit more inclusive of the many ways that people are attracted to one another. One of the problems that happens when we're talking about sexual minority communities, so LGBT people, is that it gets reduced to sex. It gets reduced to what these people are doing in the bedroom, like behind closed doors. But we know that orientation is so much more than that. Attraction is so much more than that. It's our emotional attraction. It's how we put together families. It's how we express our love for one another. It's the type of relationships that we build. So it's not just about sex. And I think that's really damaging to reduce an entire community to who we have sex with, because heterosexual people don't have that. They have the many multiple dimensions of attractionality, and we get to see that on public display very often, whether it's just out in the world or through the media, movies, that sort of thing. There's lots of different ways that attraction can show itself. Okay, so we define these concepts. We define sex, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. Hope y'all are still with me because I can't tell. But we're going to attach some language to it. So with regard to sex, remember that was the, go back real quick, the classification that's based on reproductive biology. So sex is assigned to us at birth. So the terms that we know go with sex are female, male, and sometimes intersex or intersex condition. So these are sex terms. So when you're filling out a survey, for example, and it asks you for your sex, it should list these terms. These are usually more medical terms. A lot of times you might notice, you might start to notice, hopefully after this webinar, that there are a lot of mistakes on those surveys and those intake forms. You'll often see gender, and then the options are only male or female. Well, first off, those are not gender terms. Those are sex terms. So when I'm talking about the sex as I was assigned at birth, the sex that I was assigned was female. Some people are assigned female, some people are assigned male. Most are either in one of those two categories, but another category does exist for intersex. The outdated and I'll add offensive language that used to be attached to intersex was hermaphrodite. So we don't use that term anymore. It's really outdated, but maybe that's something that you're familiar with from, you know, books that you read or what have you. So intersex condition is someone who maybe has ambiguous genitalia, maybe has external sex organs that don't match the internal sex organs that they have. Maybe they're that person with the XXY chromosome. It could manifest itself in a few different ways, but it's actually a fairly common condition. Anywhere, depending on how you define it, anywhere from 1 in 30 babies to 1 in 1,500 babies are born with some type of intersex condition. So these terms are different from our gender terms. As I was saying earlier, so the sex that I was assigned at birth was female. The gender that I identify with is woman. So there's lots and lots of different terms that can fall under gender. I work on a college campus where I hear probably new gender terms at least once a month. So here are just some of them. It's certainly not an exhaustive list. That's why I have that et cetera after genderqueer over there. But some of the more common ones that you may have heard or may have seen before, woman, man, boy, girl, transgender, cisgender, two-spirit, genderqueer, and the list goes on. So a couple of words that I'll define in here, transgender and cisgender. These terms are two sides of the same coin. So I am a cisgender person. If you want my nerdy language lesson, I'm going to give it to you whether you like it or not, because you're not in a classroom and I can't see you shake your heads. So cisgender comes from the Latin word, that front part of it, cis. It means on the same side of. And trans means across or beyond. So transgender and cisgender, I'm a cisgender person because the sex that I was assigned at birth aligns with the gender that I see myself as, so female and woman. Cisgender emerged as one of those words that was in contrast to transgender because it's really offensive to say transgender and then normal, if you understand that. So I'm a cisgender woman, and that tells a little bit about like the history of how I am a woman. That's not to say that someone who's transgender is not also a woman. They just have maybe a different history than I do. So transgender is usually used to define someone whose sex that they are assigned does not align with the gender that they see themselves as. So again, these are gender terms. Transgender is someone whose sex does not align with the gender that they internally see themselves to be. So another caveat with some of these definitions that they really do vary between people. I'm giving you the most common kind of textbook type definitions that I know to be true, but that's not to say that if I have 3 students come into my office, each of whom saying that they are transgender, and if it's relevant to the conversation, I'm going to ask them, okay, so you say that you're transgender, tell me what that means for you, because it might mean something very different to each of those people, just like any of those terms, really. The term genderqueer that's over here is kind of emerged as a term that came in contrast to this idea that you can either be a woman or a man, this binary idea. So we know that there's not really a binary that exists in nature. We've seen that time and again. So man and woman are not the only 2 options. Some people don't even see themselves on that spectrum at all. Some people see themselves as somewhere in between, but genderqueer people are often people who don't even identify with the idea that you can either be this or that. They don't even identify with the idea that there is a spectrum of gender that you may fall somewhere on. They're just, they queer that whole notion, and they exist outside of that, really. Gender expression. So before I get to the terms that I use to talk about expression, that we use to talk about expression, I want to think about some of the ways that we actually express our gender. So beyond just clothing style or hairstyle, there's lots of ways that we present gender and that gender is read, right? So in U.S. context, there are very specific ways of sitting that are gendered. There are mannerisms, there's ways of speaking, activities that we're interested in, colors that we like. So, from birth, we have birth announcements. If it's a girl, then you got pink stuff. If it's a boy, then you got blue stuff. So we gender things left and right, and it's something that's literally all around us in any way. So we express gender in lots of different ways. Gender is expressed around us. Things are read as different genders just by merely existing. And these things change from context to context in different countries. Something that's seen as very masculine in the U.S. maybe not be seen as masculine in another country. And certainly this is something that changes over time. A couple hundred years ago in the U.S., it was seen as masculine to be wearing white tights and a wig and heeled shoes. That's something that's not true anymore. It's not something that's read as masculine anymore. So gender expression is interesting because it is all around us, and sometimes it is the way that we express our gender, and sometimes it's things that people read about us. So some of the terms that go along with this are feminine, masculine, androgynous. That's someone who maybe displays aspects of both femininity and masculinity, or maybe neither. Terms like stud, femme, butch, all are ways to explain how one presents their gender. So stud and butch are kind of in similar categories. It's usually a very masculinely presenting woman. Stud is a term that's more culturally specific to African American communities, especially in Southeast Michigan, especially there's also terms like aggressive that's more like an East Coast sort of thing. Butch is kind of here and there, often, again, though, to describe a masculinely presenting woman. Just like femme is more of a femininely presenting woman. There's lots of other terms, again, that can be added into this category. Metrosexual is a fun one I always talk about because that one is one that emerged as kind of an interesting one, and probably emerged as kind of a joke, but to describe a heterosexual man who expresses himself maybe on the more feminine side. And by that I mean, I don't know, showering, getting a manicure, smelling nice. It's interesting how we define these sort of things and what we read into gender. So finally, that separate category. All these three, again, exist within one person. They exist within oneself, and in terms of expression, somewhat in relation to others. But sexual orientation is that attractionality. So there's a lot of terms that could fall into this category as well. Some of the more common ones, we have lesbian, gay, heterosexual, straight, bisexual, pansexual, same-gender loving. Same-gender loving is another one of those terms that's more culturally specific. So used to often, again, in African American communities, to define someone who's attracted to someone of similar gender. Bisexual and pansexual kind of go together sometimes. Pansexual, so bisexual, that root word, being attracted to men and to women, kind of again with that binary. Pansexual is more attraction across gender, so understanding and recognizing that there are more than just those two genders, and maybe being attracted to certain characteristics, masculinity in whatever form that takes, or intellect in whatever form that takes. Just attraction across gender. Couple terms in here. So queer is up there. So if I say that, I know there's often when I do these, people who have kind of a red flag go up and like, oh, you can't say that. That's an offensive word. So queer is one of those interesting words that has been reclaimed. That's not to say that it is not still used offensively and pejoratively against LGBT people, but it is something that that LGBT people have reclaimed, and sometimes they use it to identify with because it means not heterosexual, and it doesn't really go further than that to define. In the same way like lesbian. Lesbian is, you know, a woman who's attracted to other women. You get to know a lot of information just through that term. Queer is useful because it doesn't have a gender attached to it in the same way a word like lesbian does. So I actually often identify with the term queer. I wouldn't use that term in necessarily a lot of different regions of the country or with different generations of folks. A lot of the folks who lived through the Stonewall riots in the, you know, earlier in the 60s, 70s, 80s, that word is a really negative term still, and it's something that hasn't been reclaimed. But again, I work with college students. A lot of younger people, youth, younger folks identify with that term queer because it's useful for them. All right. At this point, I would ask if there are any questions, but if there are, please do take a note of them, and we will go over stuff at the end. I want to keep moving along for the sake of time. Okay, so we take all these concepts. I want to line them up and figure out how we place them and the assumptions that we make about different people with regard to knowledge of different identities. So we have the sex category. Say someone is assigned male at birth. They identify their gender identity as a man. They express themselves masculinely, and their sexual orientation is heterosexual. So this is kind of the societal ideal. We like people to fall within these categories. They're fitting neatly between the lines, and that's what we come to expect. That's what society in general likes to see, something neat and tidy like this. But we also know that in reality, not everyone falls so cleanly into these categories. So maybe someone assigned male at birth identifies as a man, but expresses himself more femininely. Oftentimes we know people make assumptions about his sexual orientation based on that fact alone. So the assumption is that, oh, you're a feminine man, you must be gay, right? So yeah, sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's not true. The point is that these four categories are separate and distinct from one another. Just because you know information about any one of these categories does not mean that you know information about any of the other categories. So if someone is assigned female at birth, identifies their gender as a trans man, expresses themselves masculinely, what do we know about their sexual orientation? The answer is nothing. We do not know anything about their sexual orientation based on the above information. It's kind of one of those word problems, right? So this is something to keep in mind is, you know, we're human. We're taught to make observations and then make judgments based on those observations. That's something in being a good ally and being a person who understands these concepts, unlearn those assumptions. It's not going to be true across the board for everybody, and the more assumptions that we make, the more harm we create. All right. So some takeaways. It is useful to having a working knowledge of terminology. But just because we now know all this amazing terminology does not mean that we know everything there is to know about the LGBTQ community. I would never assume to know that, and I do this work full time. Gay for pay, if you will. It's important to ask questions. It's important to let people identify for themselves what terms they use, the story behind those terms. All these things are very individual things. Knowing any one of these labels does not give you information on any others. So gender expression does not equal sexual orientation or gender identity. So in summary, we have sexual orientation is a distinct concept. That's attractionality. It's distinct from gender identity, which is our internal sense of self. And that's distinct from gender expression, which is how we express ourselves and our gender. And that's even distinct from sexual behavior. That's who we have sex with. That's why public health terminology has been created. MSM, for example, men who have sex with men, or WSW, women who have sex with women. Those are public health terms that describe sexual behavior. They don't describe sexual orientation, because orientation is so much more broad than behavior. This is a nice little tool. This is actually from a website called, it's pronounced Metrosexual, so kind of a summary piece again. This is a genderbread person. So in summary, it has, you know, identity, gender identity being in the brain. It's internally determined. Sex is, well, it has kind of the genital area circled, which, you know, I would argue it's a little bit not just there. We have expression kind of throughout one's person, and then attraction, oh, it's in the heart. That's where attraction lies, nowhere else, right? So that's kind of a nice summary piece, and this website has a lot of interesting resources if you do want to check those out on your own. I wanted to do a little bit more on the trans umbrella, and we're running short on time. So this is something that you know, catches a lot of people. They don't understand trans identities and transgender, what those terms mean. So transgender, or the trans asterisk, is an umbrella term. So the trans asterisk exists so that you can add a different suffix to it. So we have maybe trans feminine, trans masculine, trans man, trans woman. So the operative word in any of those identities, trans man, for example, usually someone who identifies as a man with maybe a transgender history. Apologize for the fire truck that's slowly going by my house right now. All right. That's fun. All right, so transsexual, it's another term that's out there. Maybe it may be more frequently used right now. I know that there's a lot of stuff around Bruce Jenner in the news right now. So transsexual is a term that's not used very much anymore. I hardly ever hear it anymore. But it's usually used to imply that someone has had or desires to have some sort of gender-affirming surgery. So you notice I don't say sex reassignment surgery. I use gender-affirming surgery because those surgeries affirm the gender that one sees oneself as. You're not being reassigned. You're being affirmed in that. So in general, before assuming anything about gender, it's respectful to ask which words people use to identify. Okay, so transitioning. Transitioning is the process that a transgender person may or may not go through in order to affirm the gender that they see themselves as. So transitioning can look in a few different ways. There's a social transition, a hormonal transition, or surgical transition. Some people may do all three of these areas. Some people may do two. Some people may do one. Some people might just identify as transgender and then not take any physical steps to change their bodies in any way. They might be fine with their bodies as is. They just identify as transgender. So that's important to know. There's not something that's a prescribed formula for every single person. Really, it's up to that individual and what they're comfortable with, and also what they have access to. Things like hormones and surgery, and even, you know, having the money to pay for the sex or gender marker change on your driver's license. All those things cost money. All those things are not always covered by insurance. In fact, pretty infrequently are they covered by insurance. So it's not something that everyone has access to or can do, but these are the different ways that people might transition. So just some recommendations now that we have all this knowledge, you know, what can we do with it? So first off is understanding that our language does matter, using inclusive terminology to the best of our abilities. Obviously, this is something that is always growing, evolving, and like I said. So it's helpful to stay up to date as any way you can. There's lots of great resources online. You know, it's also being aware of stuff like outdated terminology. So I mentioned hermaphrodite before. The word homosexual, it's another term that, you know, we might think, oh, that's the safest, the most PC, if you will, way to say something, but homosexual, the word itself has a lot of negative connotations for people. I hate hearing that word. I hate reading that word. I much prefer to see lesbian, gay, bisexual, etc. Homosexual has those negative connotations because it was listed as a diagnosis for people who had homosexuality as a mental health condition. So it has that really negative mental health stigma attached to it. Heterosexual never had that. Heterosexual was never used as a diagnosis against people the way homosexual was. So I don't use the term homosexual. That's kind of, you know, popular opinion. I do know some people who do use it, but that's one example of, you know, maybe things to avoid if you can. So using terms like sexual preference or lifestyle choice, that sort of thing, all those things are really problematic because they reduce this hard-grained identity that's true for so many people to a preference. Now, I prefer tea over coffee. I don't prefer men over or women over men. That's, you know, it's a little bit stronger than a preference for me. But that's just something that, you know, to be aware of the language that we're using ourselves and that's being perpetuated out there, because it has a negative effect on how communities are treated when it's seen as a preference or a lifestyle choice. So it's also about unlearning harmful assumptions, like everyone is heterosexual by default or cisgender by default. We know that that's not true. So starting to open up our language, maybe saying that they instead of he or she, if we don't know, if that person has not given their pronouns to us. Maybe saying things like, you know, a spouse or partner. Oh, heteronormativity is spelled wrong. I apologize. Spouse or partner instead of do you have a husband or wife? But also following people's leads. If they, you know, have a wife and they say this is my wife, then you can use wife. Just reflecting people's own language is often the easiest way to go. So what else? You know, this is something that is complex. Our attitudes about gender and sexuality are influenced by the beliefs that we were brought up with. They're influenced by the culture around us. So in order to do good activist work, good ally work, it's important to reflect on our own attitudes. And that's true whether we're a part of the LGBTQ community ourselves or not. Reflecting on our own attitudes, maybe our own internalized homophobia or transphobia, understanding where that comes from and why we have these beliefs about gender roles and that sort of thing. That's really important background work to do before you're actively engaging in this type of activism. Kind of list some of these other things up there so we can get to the question piece. All right. And so I wanted to also add this piece at the end. Wherever you are, your place of work, your home, your community center, your religious institution, any of those things, physical spaces give messages to people. So whether it's a rainbow flag sticker or a policy on your website that says you include all people, those things are very important to especially minority communities like LGBTQ people, because we look for those cues, right? We look for things that reflect our own lives and that outright say and state that they are affirming of all people. All right, I'm going to move on from this and, oh, isn't that cute? Ask and tell. I want to open it up for questions and comments about any of the things that we covered.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Ariana. I want to start off with that. This is really informative, and definitely it's going to be really, really helpful in the future.
Thank you.
I know we did have a question. Tammy Smith was wondering something that was kind of addressed, but I was hoping you could elaborate on. So the question was, although laws and policies can change, how do you really change culture? So I know you kind of talked about that in the last few slides, but can you elaborate more on what we can do to change culture and what's really needed to make that change?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if I had a quick and easy answer for that question, then I don't know, I probably wouldn't be employed. But I think it takes a lot of different things. I think changing culture takes courage on the part of a lot of people. So whether that's someone who identifies within the LGBTQ community, finding spaces that you feel comfortable being visible, finding spaces where you can connect with other folks around you and disclose of your life. This is not a possibility for everybody, so I just want to acknowledge that it is not safe for everybody to come out. It is not safe because you might lose your job still, your family might experience discrimination, you might not want to open yourself up to that. But being as visible as you can when it is safe to do so is important. But I also think that making efforts to engage in these conversations, regardless of if you're sharing of your own personal story, and this is especially true for our allies, people who don't identify within the LGBTQ community themselves, it is especially important for our allies to be the leads because they're less at risk, to be honest with you. That's why we need allies. They're not the ones who are maybe personally at risk. So it's really important that these conversations take place around, well, why does this policy exist? Or why is this question phrased this way on our intake form? Do our advertisements at this company reflect the diversity of families that we serve? I think that's an important question for any organization to ask. And so I'm talking a lot of stuff about like workplace context, but I think this is true in really any sphere that we are part of in our own communities, whether it's a community organization, a neighborhood organization, a religious organization. It's questioning the policies that exist that may not be inclusive of all people. And I think it's also thinking about you know, when we're making decisions around policies, or we're making decisions around how we're going to market something, we're making decisions around the type of event that we're going to put on, who's at the table and who's not at the table. Being a good ally is widening our lens so that we're thinking about people who don't share identities with us. So all of these sort of things, having open conversations and honest conversations are really things that add to culture change. And I think also it's being willing to call people in as well as call people out sometimes. You know, sometimes we get further along by saying, you know, outright, hey, this is really offensive, this is really exclusionary, it's not okay. Sometimes it works better for relationship preservation to call someone in and say, hey, you may not be aware of the effect that this language has on, you know, who might feel included or not. So I just want to have a conversation with you about how we can actually open it up a little bit, what different words we can use, how we can go about this a different way, and do it in a little more gentler way. And that's just to maintain those connections and those relationships that we really need. Hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you. And are there any other questions right now? Nope. Looks like that might be it. Well, all right, so I guess everybody, we can move on to the next slide and then we'll wrap up. So I'm just going to talk about this really quick. We do have another virtual family meeting coming up. So that is on June 6th, next month, and it's in just a few Saturdays. And Michael R. Krauth from the Veterans Health Administration at Veterans Affairs, he will be talking about getting what you need from your doctor, specifically for LGBT veterans. And so I think what we've gone over today, what Ariana has presented on, will really help as a good, really baseline for this next talk. And yeah, so you can go online to find out more about how to register and find out more about the event. And you can also email me personally if you'd like, and my email is right there. So, yeah. And so again, we have a lot of people messaging in Ariana to say thank you. So this was really helpful. And if you want to give this last slide information.
It was my pleasure, and thank you all so much for participating. And you know, there might be questions that come up later, so I just wanted to let everyone know that you can reach us through the email address info@mpfc.org, post a question on our Facebook wall, tweet us, you know, anything that you'd like to do. We'd be happy to follow up with any other questions that you have.
All right, thank you.